G'day everyone, I'm Liz Morrison, Climate Initiatives Lead here at the Australia Institute, and welcome to our February episode of Australia's Biggest Book Club. In 2024, the Australia Institute is celebrating its 30th anniversary. That's 30 years of big ideas and changing public policy for the better. And to celebrate, we're hosting loads of special events like the one you're joining us for today, as well as some special guests on speaking tours. And we'll be taking a look at the history of our research and how influential it's been. Our research has been incredibly influential this month. I'm sure you've all seen, as friends of the Institute, that the Stage 3 tax cuts passed the Senate on Tuesday. Thank you so much. It's been a huge win. The Australia Institute has been leading this advocacy for years and years and years. We've done 20 research reports, as well as countless other pieces of web posts, content, videos, webinars, related to that Stage 3 work. The research revealing that HEX collects more money than the PRRT, the Petroleum Resource Rent Tax, has gone totally viral after Richard Dennis's speech at the National Press Club, which has renewed calls for fossil fuel companies to pay more for the damage that they cause. And the Australia Institute's research on the right to disconnect has been at the forefront of new laws that prevent employers from contacting employees unreasonably outside of their work hours. So the Australian Institute research is absolutely hitting all of the home runs at the moment. So thank you so much for your support in all of that. I'd like to start this webinar by acknowledging that we all live and work on unceded Aboriginal land. I'm joining here from Canberra on Ngunnawal and Ngambri country, and I pay respects to elders past, present and emerging. And if you're in the chat, I encourage you all to name the country that you are joining us from. It's really lovely to see so many people from all over the country acknowledging the Aboriginal traditional owners. Australia's Biggest Book Club will be on once a month, but days and times vary for our webinars. So please visit our website for details of upcoming events. And the next episode in March, we'll be hosting Cameron Murray in conversation with Chief Economist Greg Jericho on his new book, The Great Housing Hijack. You can find details on our events page. Just a few tips for Zoom. If you hover over the bottom of the screen, you should be able to see a Q&A function where you can ask questions of the lovely Chanel, and you can upvote everyone else's questions, and we'll have time for Q&A at the end of the conversation. Please keep things civil and on topic in the chat, or we'll boot you. This one especially, it's one that we want to take extra care with and be really respectful of others. So thank you for your cooperation on that. This discussion is being recorded and will be uploaded to our website as soon as we can. And our conversation today will discuss some difficult topics such as sexual assault and rape. So please take care while listening. If you need support, help is available. You can call 1-800-RESPECT. That's 1-800-737-732. You can call Lifeline on 13 11 14 or Kids Helpline on 1-800-55-1800. All right, that's all the housekeeping out of the way. Thank you so much for bearing with me through that. Our guest today is the inimitable Chanel Contos, a consent activist who took Australia by storm in 2021 when she posted on Instagram asking people to share their stories of sexual assault during their schooling years. The post went viral and 7,000 young people sent in testimonies describing behaviour that constitutes rape. Since then, Chanel has become Australia's leading consent activist and has achieved major outcomes for the harmonisation of consent laws across Australia and has gotten consent education onto the national curriculum. Her new book, Consent Laid Bare, challenges the outdated social contract that privileges men's sexual pleasure at the expense of women's humanity, and is a must-read for every man, woman, and person in Australia. Welcome, Chanel, and thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me, Liz. I'm really happy to be joining from Gadigal land here today, and pay my respects as well to elders past and present and all Indigenous people on the call with us today.
Oh, great to have you with us. Congratulations on Consent Laid Bare. It's a really powerful book, and I know it's already having a strong impact on the conversation in Australia, and how people are talking about sex and relationships and respect. So congratulations and thank you for that work.
Thanks so much. It's been great. Yeah, it's the feedback from the book. It was so underwhelming actually to publish a book because the launch date was like you know, in my mind, I was like, this is the day, this is the big thing, like September 12th. But obviously no one reads it on the day it comes out. Like no one even has like the physical time to. So on the actual day, I was like, this is the most underwhelming experience of my life. But then since then, it's been very overwhelming as people have started telling me, you know, amazing stories of how it's changed things they've done or conversations they've had or people they've passed it on to that's helped them. Lots of great feedback from men, which has been really nice.
Yeah, great. And you're finding that it is being well read by women, of course, but by men as well?
Yeah, I mean, obviously it's definitely massively skewed by women, but I've gotten, I mean, quite a significant amount of messages, I would say, just on Instagram of people saying they read the book or, you know, their wife passed it on to them or they were recommended it because they were in an argument with someone at the office. And it changed their perspective on things. But I definitely, when I wrote the book, the last chapter of the book is called Dear Boys and Men. So that is for the intention of passing that specifically on to people who may not want to read the whole book, and hopefully it acts as a little bit of a kind of like gateway chapter into the whole book. But I also think the kind of tone of the whole book was targeted so that you know, any gender could read it and feel it was relatable and relevant.
Wow, that's great. But yeah, and that last chapter again is a sort of a summary for me at the end of reading it, but also as a gateway. I think that's a really powerful and smart way to present your ideas. So let's jump into the questions. A quote that really stood out to me in the book was, "All men benefit from the behavior of men who do bad things." Can you tell me a little bit more about that quote and how that sort of manifests in society?
Yeah, so I guess the idea is if we're thinking about gendered power structures and we're thinking about how we have men holding more power, whether that's, you know, in terms of actual positions, in terms of money, whatever it is, but also just in terms of social contract. The idea that it also comes from the kind of notion that rape is a means by which all men keep all women in a state of fear. So I think that, I know we talk about it all the time, but women walking down the street, you know, holding their car keys, thinking about which way to walk home, taking the well-lit route, these kind of like consistent ways that we need to change our day-to-day behaviors that men do not need to do. Even if you are not a man who perpetrates violence against women or against anyone, we don't know which men do and which men don't. Therefore, we need to treat all men as if they could. And therefore, we need to act at all times as if they could. So it not only benefits men as a gender class, but it also means that we have lower standards of treatment and lower expectations. I think, I'm trying to remember exactly where that quote is in the book, but I think it may be in the hookup culture, which I guess is also referring to the fact that if the norm is for men to treat their sexual partners or women with like quite low respect and disregard, then when a man is treating a woman well or nicely or with the respect that she deserves, it's celebrated, even though that should actually be the bare minimum. So it's basically saying the bar is on the floor, and the fact that the bar is on the floor means that any men who is slightly above the floor get celebrated as if they're the roof.
Yeah, no, I think it's a really powerful barometer to take into reading the rest of the book and about the sort of standards of behavior and respect that you expect from men. And I think that quote really encapsulated the changes that the way that I changed thinking about my relationships with men after reading your book. So thank you for putting it so neatly and tidily into a little quote for all of us. My next question is a little bit heavier. So a reminder again to everyone who's listening, please take care. If you need support, there's helpline numbers in the chat. Wanted to start with the real basics of what rape actually is. I think in your book, you explore a lot about the sort of public perceptions of rape being violent and by a stranger, and really quite like prosecutable in the courts. But in your book, you tease out a lot of different situations that constitute rape that people might not be so comfortable identifying as rape. So if you could please go into a little bit of that 101 for us, that would be really, really great.
Yeah, so I guess so it's such an interesting question because it actually can be quite difficult to answer because I think there are so many nuances, which I guess is kind of the whole point. But interestingly, the history of the word rape and the criminal prosecution rape, so like in the UK, for example, the definition of rape is still non-consensual intercourse with a penis, which I think is really interesting because it acknowledges that like gendered lens to the act. Whereas most states and territories in Australia now use sexual assault instead of the word rape in their actual formal legislation. But it is, essentially the same thing. It's with any other foreign object as well, or any other body part. And the legality of the term rape is also interesting because if we think way back to when laws were created by men for men, when rape was a crime against another man because you were damaging a woman's property. Sorry, you were damaging a man's property. You were either damaging their daughter or their wife. The histories and the way that we created the legal system around sexual violence was not with women's autonomy in mind. And I think because of the way that sexual assault and rape is portrayed in the media, the types of cases we hear about, I don't know if anyone else is into this, but I love like a serial killer podcast or like a true crime story.
Yeah.
Guilty pleasure could be my line of work, but just interesting to kind of know these things. All of these kind of really extreme examples of very planned, very malicious, very intentional, very sadistic forms of rape, I think, is what holds the stereotype of what as a society we think rape is. But in reality, the vast majority of rape, especially that experienced in youth. So again, my work and my book also really focuses on this idea of kind of like teen on teen perpetrated or youth on youth perpetrated sexual violence, more out of normality rather than malice. And when we kind of include that breadth of experiences, things like sexual coercion, things like intoxication making consent void, things like external pressures or the pressure from the person in front of you, blackmail, threatening, all of these kind of different aspects that can come into play, that can be done literally just verbally and usually not violent in the way that we would think it or physically violent. We really expand that definition out. And I think that we actually need to start thinking about rape as a spectrum and start acknowledging that experiences that sit all along the spectrum are still completely valid, but we need to demolish that stereotype of a rape only being a extremely violent act, not only for the purpose of understanding the experiences of the victim, but also so that we can hold space and understand that we can hold space and understand the perpetration of this and how it's possible that alleged perpetrators are doing these things. Because I think the stereotypes of rape being a violent, intentional, and sadistic act enable people to go free without accountability because we think this doesn't match up with the rest of their personality.
Yeah, definitely. And in the book, you sort of describe, yes, sadistic, yes, angry, the sort of forms that we recognize from media, from stories, all of that. But you also sort of introduce a new way of thinking about rape and who can be a rapist. And it's the words you use to describe is opportunistic entitlement. And so can you please just tell us a little bit more about opportunistic entitlement and how it manifests in sexual assault and sort of the societal factors that create those conditions?
Yeah, so essentially, for some context, I basically found this research when I was doing my dissertation, and my dissertation was basically into rape culture in private schools in Australia, which is no surprise. And it was a typology that split rapists into 4 categories. Of course, this doesn't fit with everyone. It's a framework and someone can be more than one or different things at once. But I found it really interesting because it sat in forensic psychiatry field, so understanding why men rape, for the purpose of how they can rehabilitate this to prevent it happening in the future. But I was like, oh no, this belongs in the kind of gender sphere and the sexual violence sphere, because this is so important to understanding why this stuff happens. And the first three types of rapists, I go into much more detail in the book, but essentially the kind of stereotypical, what we think of, there's a sadistic type, an angry type, and a compensatory type who perpetrate sexual violence in order to feel masculine, basically, and valid. But the fourth type of rapist was what interested me the most. And in literature, they were called opportunistic rapists. But I coined the term entitled opportunist because I think entitlement is paramount to understanding exactly why this type of person perpetrates. And so an opportunistic rapist, entitled opportunistic rapist, never plans their attacks, almost always uses coercion or words or alcohol rather than any sort of physical violence, or it could be a very small amount of physical action, like slight amount of pushing or something like that, but not you're not going to come away from the situation in pain or anything like that. These types of people tend to be very opportunistic and kind of go-getters and like don't take no for an answer in real life, which is the exact type of attributes that our society highly celebrates in all men. They almost always perpetrate for the first time when they're teenagers, so essentially when they start becoming sexually active, because again, this idea of entitlement, I think, is key to this, to understanding that their own sense of sexual entitlement and gratification is what enables them to perpetrate sexual violence, potentially unknowingly. They tend to be extremely self-centered and used to instant gratification, especially in a sexual way. And I'm going to say it because we're all adults here, the way that our society socializes men and women differently means that men are used to instant sexual gratification, and they are told that their sexual pleasure and experience is paramount, whilst women's are consistently dismissed. And what was most interesting to me is, unlike the other three types where rehabilitation programs tended to not work at all, basically, an entitled opportunist is very, very, very unlikely to reoffend if they are held accountable or educated about what they've done. What was most interesting to me is that in this research, an entitled opportunist made up the vast majority of sex offenders. But this research was only done on rapists who had been convicted for their crimes and were in prison, which means that if you kind of take a zoom back and think about what type of rape or rapist our legislation system, our legal system actually puts in jail and holds accountability for, they're going to be the more stereotypical type. It's going to be the stranger rape. It's going to be the violent rape. It's very hard to prosecute someone when the question is consent or no consent. So which actually means that like pretty much the only relevant problem is these people. And in my mind, almost everyone is a potential entitled opportunist. But what we need to do is change the script around it and educate on how to enact in sexual situations so that that entitlement doesn't outweigh the empathy that someone feels towards someone.
Yeah, absolutely. There are so many follow-up questions that I have from what you've just talked about. And so maybe I'll just send you a couple and you can weave them together how you feel. One is about the separation of the legality of rape and sort of, like you said, about that study was only done on men that had been convicted of their crimes. How do you separate prosecuting a rape in that sense versus the sort of social license of rape, and if it's maybe a little bit hard to identify that your experience has been a rape compared to just an unwanted sexual experience, that like how do you separate this legal framework from the social framework to understand and hold accountability? You talk a lot about formal and informal accountability in the book. And there's a quote that really stood out to me at the beginning where you were talking to a bunch of men around a campfire at a party or something, and you said, it is socially acceptable to rape. And that blew my mind a little bit, because it is when you think about this spectrum, maybe not at the extreme of the spectrum, but across the rest of it, our society does make it socially acceptable to rape. So if you could just tease out those ideas a little bit, that would be great.
Yes. Okay. So a few things there. I'm just going to go on a bit of a interrupt me if I'm going too far. I'll move back. But so firstly, this idea of the legal system definition of rape and the reality of experiences. So again, the problem with our legal system, it is getting better. We do have affirmative consent being rolled out, which across Australia at the moment, and hopefully with the campaign around harmonizing consent laws, we see that in place soon. And affirmative consent is really important because it completely flips the script around consent and asks the question, did they say yes, rather than did they say no? And the problem with the question, did they say no, is that that assumes that the default access to a woman's body is a yes, unless told otherwise. And that really irks me. So, but the other problem with our criminal system is we know the problems. It's often quite re-traumatizing for victims to go through it. There's really low rates of prosecution for, again, this idea of did consent happen? And the result of that has been, in Australia, we have a 1.5% prosecution rate for sexual assault, which essentially means that we have decriminalized rape as a country. And that's a really hard thing to sit with and think about, but it's true. So we have a few options. It's like, okay, do we keep trying to change the system that was, again, created for men by men when rape was damaging the property of another man? Or do we try to invent new systems? Do we look towards restorative justice options? Do we look towards mediation options? Do we look towards kind of like different forms of an interesting one was with the New South Wales Police in 2021. I launched Operation Vest, which was an alternative reporting option for victim survivors. So providing another option where, you know, they could go down the traditional police route, or they could do this anonymous reporting, or not anonymous, but don't action it, that they could follow up with on a later date if they wanted to. And rates of reporting in New South Wales went up an unprecedented 61% or 59%. Actually, and 51% in the state and 69% in Sydney, which just shows that, you know, victim survivors are dying to have other options. Like they're really, really asking for it, asking for these systems that improve the autonomy they have over the situation. And then the other thing in form of accountability, it's like, okay, well, what do we do socially about this? Because we all know someone who's been sexually assaulted who didn't report it, because why would they? I mean, I wouldn't. And what can we do to make it so that they experience some level of accountability from friends? The same way that, I mean, this is obviously diminishing the situation, but I'm just thinking when we were a teenager, if someone like cheated on their girlfriend or boyfriend, everyone would be quite mad at them. You know, everyone would have a conversation with them and be like, that's not okay. Like, that's behavior we don't agree with, like, blah, blah, blah. They would talk about it. They might get kicked out of the group. They might, like, whatever it is. We don't even have that for sexual assault. We just have this idea of, no, they didn't do it, it's not true, unless we get a criminal conviction, which also adds to kind of false narratives that a lot of people make up these crimes, because again, unless you are one of those 1.5% who gets a guilty sentence, it's not understanding all of the other things that could have happened. That doesn't mean that it didn't happen. It just means that they weren't deemed guilty. And I think to understand the sentence I said, where I said rape is socially acceptable, I stand by that. I said that at a campfire with my guy friends in probably 2019 or 2018 or something like that. And I rattled off to them 10 boys that they know, who they play rugby with, who they see on nights out, and, you know, slap them up and say hi, who had sexually assaulted and or raped friends of mine. And I was like, you're all friends with them. And I was like, I don't know a single person that you know that has been convicted of this. And in fact, there was actually one person convicted temporarily, and then who got not guilty, quite a high profile case that went to their school, who they all knew, to prove the point even more. And a way to understand how that happens is to think about the rape culture pyramid. So there's a diagram in the book, but it looks like a pyramid, like a triangle. And the bottom layer of that pyramid has things such as misogynistic jokes, sexist language, locker room banter. And then the next layer of that pyramid has things like catcalling, street harassment. The next layer of the pyramid has things like sending unsolicited naked images to someone or forwarding an image of someone else, so image-based abuse, non-consensual sexual touching, and it kind of builds upon itself to then more insidious forms of sexual violence, such as stealthing, or the very top of the pyramid, sexual assault and rape. And the idea is that because we let all of those things at the bottom go unchecked and unnoticed, we allow a culture where the things on top can exist and not seem out of place in our society. And I think that's really the key thing here. It's not just that sexual violence is happening at devastating rates, it's that it is normal, so much so that often victims don't even understand that it counts as an act of rape until they are older and educated on consent or what the definition of sexual assault is in their state or territory. And even more shocking, that perpetrators can perpetrate sexual assault without unknowingly, which is, I guess, also the whole point of my work. It's like, okay, well, let's make it knowingly, let's educate them. And then my theory is that rates of sexual violence would reduce massively.
Yeah, I completely agree. And I think through the book, you sort of grapple with the question of like, did the person know that what they were experiencing constituted rape? And did the person that was doing it know that what they were doing constituted rape? And so here at the Australia Institute, we are all about policy progress and policy changes for a better Australia. And you mentioned a couple of things I want to give you a chance to talk about, some really big policy wins that you've had, about the harmonisation of stealthing laws across the country. And then I would love to get into sort of consent education. We've got a lot of questions in the chat about it, and I'll spread that out a little bit more when we get there. But yeah, I just want to talk about the real policy impact that your work has had, starting with stealthing laws.
Yeah, so for anyone who doesn't know, stealthing is the non-consensual removal of a condom during sex, or failing to put one on when previously having agreed to do so. So essentially not wearing a condom when you've said you would. And just to address some other things that come up when I talk about this is different to reproductive coercion slightly, in that from understanding motives behind why people stealth, it tends to come after the question of, are you on the pill or are you on some form of protection? So it really is more about male sexual entitlement than it is about intentionally trying to get someone pregnant. But that is also definitely a massive factor and experience of many people. And the thing with stealthing is it's a really complicated form of sexual violence, because in order for it to be stealthing, that is the act of sexual assault, it means that the sexual encounter must be consented to with a condom. Therefore, all of the barriers to reporting and understanding sexual violence are heightened, because you're most likely going to have, quite positive feelings towards this person, and you were consenting to a sexual act with them with protection. And essentially, the way the law was previously, it was just a bit like murky whether this counted as sexual violence or not. You definitely could argue that it was an act of sexual assault, but you had to go through the process of arguing that. So the purpose of the stealthing campaign was to explicitly criminalize it, to put in legislation that removing a condom without consent makes consent void, and that's not an argument. And the law's there for, one thing, to protect people who are going forth reporting this, but really more than anything for this, it was more about using legislation as an education tool, because so many people who perpetrate stealthing, I really don't think that they understand the gravity of what they're doing is wrong. And as part of this advocacy with the Australia Institute, we hosted a roundtable, and often in my work when I host roundtables, I elevate the voices of youth victim survivors and try to get basically policymakers or legislators to listen to them and hopefully use that. But this was actually my favorite roundtable and advocacy move ever, because it was so powerful, because I recorded a man who very kindly was willing to let me record our conversation, and he basically was 28 years old now, and he said 10 years ago that, you know, he was at a weekend away with friends, he slept with one of his friends, they'd been drinking quite a lot, he wasn't able to get hard, and he wanted to have sex. Therefore, his entitlement to that situation meant that he took the condom off without her knowing, to make it easier. And, you know, it caused great distress for her. You know, she had to take the morning after pill and was really upset, and he didn't understand the impact that would have had on her feeling of body autonomy as well in that situation. And it was really powerful, because he was saying this, and he said, it kind of felt wrong, but I didn't know it was illegal, and I wouldn't have done it if I knew it was wrong, or if I knew it was illegal. And I think that's kind of the crux of what we're trying to prevent here with criminalizing stealthing, not only to create those protective measures for people who experience it, but to prevent people perpetrating it, and to raise awareness around it as well, because I also think it's something that, I think it's quite a generational thing. My theory, this could be completely wrong, but my theory is that, I don't know, like me and Liz and stuff, you know, we know people that this has happened to, we understand, like it's a kind of common phenomenon to an extent. Whereas when I speak to older people about it, they seem really shocked about it. And I think that's also because older generations grew up in like the era of AIDS pandemic and things like that, where wearing condoms was like much more emphasized, and there was like much more of a health narrative around that, which maybe the health scare of that may have counteracted that sort of male entitlement. Whereas in this day and age with you know, STI checks and widespread contraception, or like less education around things like AIDS or sexually transmitted infections that are harder to get rid of, the kind of that thought isn't there as much for people perpetrating this.
Yeah, for sure. And I think yeah, that sort of notion of like knowing it's a bit wrong, but not how wrong, and I wouldn't have done it if it's illegal. I think that really gets back to what we were talking about earlier about formal and informal accountability. Like if it feels a bit wrong, but your mates are probably going to be like, woo, yeah, go you, big night out, woohoo, then that doesn't solve anything. But maybe you need to implement a legal structure. But then if the legal structure doesn't work for women, then how do you achieve the accountability that you need to disincentivize that behavior?
Yeah. So I realized it didn't actually say the win we got. So also working really closely with Sienna Parrott from the Australia Institute, we criminalised stealthing in Queensland and South Australia, and now there's only Northern Territory and WA to go, basically, and we've kind of had commitment from the Northern Territory. So big win, and hoping that in the next kind of like 12 months we'll have a harmonisation of that across Australia, and then can run a campaign to educate everyone about it.
Huge congratulations to you and to Sienna Parrott on that incredible win. Australia is going to be better for it, and like it is remarkable the impact that 2 young women have had on changing the entire country. So huge congratulations on that win. Another win that you've had is on consent education in schools. I want to just spend some time talking about consent education and respectful relationships education, and how can we make sure that everyone is receiving the best consent and respectful relationships education that they can in schools, no matter where they go to school. We've had a lot of questions in the chat about religious schools, about single-sex schools, about private schools. I just wanted to get your thoughts on that more broadly, and then we'll jump into some more questions from the chat.
Yeah, so the policy change of mandated consent education is in the Australian national curriculum. So every school in Australia, except for schools specifically for people with disabilities, which is a massive shame, and I think that needs its own kind of campaign. But most schools in Australia, private, public, religious sector schools, Catholic sector, all have to teach to the minimum Australian curriculum, or they can teach to the state curriculum, but the state curriculums have to go off the national curriculum. So it's basically like baseline, and then there's extra baselines, and then they pick that or that. which means that consent education will definitely become a norm. The challenge, as you just so rightly pointed out, Liz, is how is it going to be actually delivered? Because that's all well and good to say, and I'm so excited about it, but what happens, individual teacher, individual classroom. Some classrooms may be taught by people who are, all around the stuff, so excited that it's in the curriculum and have the opportunity and the confidence to deliver this information to their students. Other teachers may have been teaching for 40 years and suddenly have to talk about, consent and sex to their pupils, and they're freaking out about it. So there is a $77 million consent education implementation package that the Albanese government launched as one of their election campaign promises with me, which was cool. And
congratulations, that's major.
Thanks. And I sit on the government reference panel of figuring out how to best spend that money, basically, and how to allocate it across the industries, and what support we can give people. The idea as well is that states would match that, so that the federal government gives money to the states, and then hopefully the states also invest money in it, and then there's even more money going around to help schools implement it. But yeah, essentially acknowledging that implementation is a massive challenge, something that I would love to see, and something that I've kind of been like background thinking about / doing little bits on for a while, is bringing there's also an initial teacher education curriculum, so a curriculum that universities use to credit someone as a teacher in Australia, and I would love that to have some sort of training on not just how to deliver consent education, because obviously not every teacher will, but more so how to ensure that you're promoting healthy relationships and respectful culture within schools. If you're a year coordinator or you're on playground duty and you hear something, or you're in charge of detention one day and something's happened, basically just trying to equip more people in that. But yeah, implementation is on the radar. It's a challenge and it's going to be hard, but I think it's something that with time will be good. Oh, and the other thing is that the Australian Human Rights Commission is going to run a survey measuring young people's understandings of consent, and that will understand like the cross section of like which types of sectors and things like that, so that we can understand what we need to be improving on, and what's working, what's not working, things like that.
Yeah, it's entirely true. There have been a few questions in the chat about single sex schools, which brought me back to one of my main questions when I was reading your book. Do you think that male empathy can be taught at all in schools to adults? And I'm thinking about, when I was reading about it, something that was in the news recently came across my mind, Newington Boys School becoming co-ed, and just the ways that school will have to adjust the way that it teaches its students to include more genders. And yeah, just really reflecting on how boys are taught differently to girls, and whether male empathy can be taught, whether they should be kept, whether girls and boys should be taught separately about consent, given that we're conditioned differently. Yeah, I would just love your reflections on that.
So it is such a hard question. I think, one, can male empathy be taught? Of course. I think people think that it's really hard to teach empathy, and like, of course there are outliers in society who don't feel empathy, but they're like literally sociopaths or like narcissists, and they should be understood as a separate class, whereas the general person can definitely learn empathy. And I know that we're good at teaching empathy because we teach it very well to girls from a young age. And what I think we lack with is, I think we're also really good at teaching boys to feel empathy for their immediate surroundings and their immediate people. I think what we lack is that kind of extra layer of like, okay, well, the classic people, like, in order to tug at a man's heartstrings, you need to relate it to their sister or their mother or their friend. But it's like, well, what about it just being a person in their own right that's not related to you, or kind of maybe they're from a different country or a different class or a different race or a different gender. So yes, we definitely can teach male empathy, but I also think that that's something that parents need to teach kind of far long before students even get to school. And that's a big task, to ask a teacher to teach 30 kids at once how to be empathetic. So I think that's definitely on the parents of how they're raising the next generation of boys and noting how they're raising their boys and girls differently. And, maybe you're raising your girls to be more polite and quiet and empathetic and considerate and celebrating those attributes in her, whilst you're not doing the same. And your boys, maybe you're saying, don't cry. That's not manly. And the other part of the question about kind of like single sex skills and Newington and things like that, I didn't realize it would be such a controversial topic or debate. But we cannot forget that same way the law was made for men, by men, blah blah blah. Schools, like women used to not be able to go to school. These all boys schools that exist in places like Sydney, Melbourne, Adelaide, Perth, they were not created for like, oh, this is a space for boys because we want boys to be together and have this moment. They were a school. They were just a school. It just happened to be an all boys school because girls weren't allowed to go, or it wasn't normal for girls to go to school. So then girls' schools had to be built in retaliation. So I think the fact that these really historic old institutions that have really deep power structures embedded in all different ways, again, in terms of class structures, in terms of race, colonial powers, like the whole lot, I think that we should see it as a positive thing that they are now opening their grounds to girls as well. Because again, a lot of these schools have like the most incredible facilities and opportunities and, like swimming pools and gymnasiums and like all like, amazing things. Of course, they're still extremely exclusive, but I think that women should have an opportunity to be in those spaces. But on the other hand, I also deeply appreciate the need for single sex spaces for women, just because they are safe spaces. And I appreciate that when I go into co-ed schools, whilst it may be, a place where there's more gender equality and maybe boys feel as though they can relate more to women because they're around them all day, every day, I'm yet to not encounter a year group where there's not a girl who's been a victim of sexual assault by a boy in that year group. So I think it is really important. I went to an all-girls school and it was such a privilege learning free from like the male gaze and, in a real culture of feminism. So it is a complicated thing. I think the other thing to note is like people would get really angry when I say that like I think it's important to have single sex schools for girls, but it's not a and that, celebrating schools like Newington or other schools like are going co-ed, but it's not a human right to have a safe space for boys. And it's not a human right to go to a elite private education institution. So I think that broadening them and making them more inclusive can only be a good thing.
Yeah, completely agree. We'll jump to questions in the chat now. Annabelle S asks, the rise of Andrew Tate and the views he espouses is really concerning. How do you holistically and effectively engage with young boys and young men on this? Labeling him a sexist or another name seems to further galvanize his supporters. It seems a lot of young men are struggling to understand what being a man is and are drifting towards problematic, hypermasculine and toxic views.
Yeah, I completely agree, Annabelle. This idea of I think in an era of growing equality, men are really struggling with where their place is in society, and I think they're getting confused. I think they're getting confused because I actually saw this laid out really well the other day. They like named traits that, we respect in men, which I actually think we should say are traits that we respect in anyone. But say things like leadership. That's like a trait that we celebrate. But then the shadow trait of that is things like being really controlling. And I think helping young boys find that line is really important. And honestly, I think the rise of Andrew Tate it's young men, they're not even knowing they're doing it, but they're screaming, saying that he felt a need for them. Andrew Tate is one of the only men that young boys respond to, and you ask like, who's a role model of yours? Because there are not enough male role models for them. And what he does is, he gives advice that 5 times out of 10 is probably completely fine, not bad. Exercise, stay strong for the people around you, work hard, blah blah blah. do 10 push-ups every morning, whatever, and then throws in these really misogynistic ideas alongside them. And I think that can be really confusing. But more than anything, I think it's showing that as a society we've failed to provide healthy role models for men, or tell them that being a man just means literally doing whatever makes you the best version of yourself, whatever makes you the best person that you want to be. But I really appreciate the struggle that young people are having as gender roles are kind of getting demolished and then rebuilt in different ways. And there's also the way that algorithms work on Instagram and TikTok means that once you're in this, you're like really in this, and it can be really hard to get views from the other way.
Yeah, definitely. Do you think that social media can be harnessed for good in that way? I think, like you say, algorithms tend to pull people to the extreme rather than to a sort of gentle, balanced input of ideas and information. And just wondering, do you think social media is possible to be used in that way?
Yeah, I think it's definitely possible to be used for good. Overall, net positive, net negative, I'm not entirely sure. I think it depends on the person, how they engage in it, what algorithms they're on, their mental health going into the app and how it impacts them. I mean, like we're about to run a $3.5 million government project of creating social media resources around consent and respectful relationships. So the idea is basically to just get like this content on young people's feeds, just to drip feed it and make it normal to have this content reinforced to them. And I mean, teachers' consent started on Instagram, so I think lots of good has come from that. And I think social media is one of the biggest powers of our generations. It's meant that we have been able to band together in mass. We've been able to organize protests, walkouts, sign petitions, share posts, like do things that takes us just like a little second of our time. And then someone with no significant power, like myself, can galvanize thousands at once, and we can make significant change because we have the support of so many other people. So I think social media definitely can be good. But what is creepy about it is like if you just sign up to TikTok and say you're a boy, like you just give it only that information, one of the first clips you'll get is a video from Andrew Tate, and then the second clip you'll get will be an extremely sexualized video of like a borderline 18-year-old girl dancing, often in like school uniform. And then it's like it just gets you in this algorithm really quickly of showing you like quite sexualized content, often of minors, and really misogynistic men, which is really creepy. Another thing, like on the algorithm thing, I also talk about this in my book. My boyfriend like showed me, he was like, oh my gosh, no, look at this, because something I talk about a lot is deep fakes, which is essentially AI technology that can manipulate a video to make someone look like they're saying something they're not or doing something they're not. And deep fakes the technology has advanced really like creepily accurately for women's bodies, and basically pornographic videos of women are being made with their face artificially manipulated on them. This happened to Taylor Swift like a few weeks ago, which kind of made it more mainstream and known about. And my boyfriend, again, all TikTok knows about him is that he's a man, and he got targeted an ad of deepfake technology being like, be anyone you want to be. And I'm like, I spent a lot of time on TikTok as a woman. I have never received an ad about deepfaking my body, and like, so why are men getting this? And I asked other men, and apparently that's something that just kind of comes up the same way that I like consistently get advertised like bra and undie brands.
It's absurd. It's completely, yeah, it's so gross. Yeah, and I think the more that we can have discussions about algorithms and change our own algorithms, I think that is absolutely an area that needs a lot of work. We're coming close to time, so I just want to chat through a couple of questions from the chat that are really all about like how to practice consent in real life. So one of the questions is, how do you practice consent or say no when you think it might ruin the mood? Like, what are some practical ways of doing consent?
So basically, consent can never ruin the mood. And if you're worried that consent's going to ruin the mood, what would like really ruin the mood is sexual violence. So like, you should never be scared of that, basically. Sorry, I shouldn't laugh. I laugh at heavy topics because all I do all day every day is talk about this. And practical ways to ask for consent, it's literally like, does this feel good? Can I touch you here? Can you touch me here? They can be like really simple one-liners, like a few words. You can read consent through body language, so like enthusiastic body language, but I always recommend and advise that the first time you're having a sexual encounter with a new partner, that you do have explicit verbal consent. And also the most important way to practice consent is ensure that you have made a safe space for someone to say no, and that you don't get offended if they don't want to or don't say no. So, just be like, that's okay, let's just chill, why don't we cuddle for a bit, or like, why don't we go back to the party, or like, do you want to go for a walk, or like, well, how about we watch a movie? Making a safe space to say no is the only way that you can really guarantee that you're practicing consent properly, because yes doesn't count if no wasn't safe to say. I don't think we have time to get into that now, but that also goes deep in the book about different like trauma responses to sexual violence and feeling threatened, called fawning, and how sometimes people say yes or do actions out of fear. So that's again why body language is an important part of this puzzle. And ultimately empathy. So something I always say is, if you're confused about consent, all you need to do is be empathetic in a sexual situation. If you're thinking about how your sexual partner's feeling, if you're thinking about their pleasure, their experience, it is impossible to violate someone's consent.
For sure. And a couple of other questions just in the Q&A box about how do you see sort of restorative justice and mediation operating as an alternative to the legal structures of accountability?
I would love to see this, because I think the other problem with our legal system is that because there's such a high chance that the accused will get found not guilty, why would they ever plead guilty? Which means that not only are they not taking any accountability of themselves, they're also dismissing the like reality and experience of the victim survivor. So I think restorative justice could be massive. They did some trial run on it in New Zealand, and it had something nuts like 91% satisfaction from victim survivors, which is just like unprecedented, that like, in the process of reporting such a thing like this. I'm also really pro it because, again, so much of this stuff happens as in youth. So we're actually talking about child sexual abuse being perpetrated by other children, and the criminal system is no place for children. So how do we make it so that, again, we're apologizing, we're centering empathy, we're trying to disincentivize other people from doing it, prevent the person reoffending without making literal children go through the criminal system.
And the last question that we have, which I think is a really good one to end on, Chanel, what is your best advice for a teacher looking for immediate resources to further their learning to deliver the best consent education possible right now? And I'm going to jump in with the first one, which is you should go out and buy Consent Laid Bare and do that as a suggested reading in your classes. But yeah, Chanel, if you have any other resources, that'd be great.
No, honestly, that would be, I forgot about that. Giving the book to the students would be a really impactful way of just like really getting the whole thing, starting conversations, especially if you have, boys and girls in the class, to, like so many boys have read the book and just be like, I was just shocked reading this stuff. And then I spoke to my female friends about it and they're like, yeah, obviously. So I think it's a really good way to, I guess, like ignite that empathy and then feel really validating, especially for young people who potentially instinctively know and understand these things and these structures, but haven't ever had them like spelled out to them or like read to them. In terms of resources, so Our Watch has the line, Teachers Consent is about to create resources, but we don't have them yet, so tune in next year for that. But yeah, honestly, if you just Google like consent education resources for this group, there actually is a lot of really great stuff. There's lots of incredible people who just like in different bits and bobs put things together to make it the best they can be. But yeah, Consent Laid Bare recommended reading. Also, just one thing, I saw a question in the chat that I wanted to answer, but I clicked something and I actually think I deleted it accidentally. It was from Anonymous and it was about sex work, and I just want to say that there's a whole chapter in the book around sex work that I think will relate to the experience that you mentioned.
Great. Thank you so much. That's all we have time for, Chanel. Thank you for your book and for all that you do. Our friends at Pan Macmillan have a special offer on Consent Laid Bare for members of Australia's biggest book club. So if you would like 25% off the retail price, just jump onto the Pan Macmillan website, select direct from the drop-down menu, buy options, and then enter the discount code Contos Book Club 29 at the checkout. And you can find Chanel on Instagram at Teach Us Consent and at Chanel C. So you can keep up to date with everything she's doing, including those incredible consent resources that will be there when those are available. And just a reminder that if anything we've discussed today has affected your mental health, please take care and consider seeking support by calling 1-800-RESPECT. That's 1-800-737-732, Lifeline on 13 11 14, or Kids Helpline on 1-800-55-1800. Take care of yourselves. We really hope to see you all at next month's Australia's biggest book club with Cam Murray on the Great Housing Hijack. That's on at 11 a.m. on the 28th of March. And you can also check out the Australia Institute's website for all of our other upcoming events. We've got some incredible stuff coming up. His Excellency Inote Tong, former president of Kiribati, is doing a speaking tour with us through March, as is Yanis Varoufakis, talking all about economics and climate. And so those will be some incredible in-person events held in Adelaide, Melbourne, Sydney, Canberra, all of it. So if you're around, we'd love to see you at any of those. And make sure you're subscribed to our podcasts, Follow the Money, and Greg Jericho's new podcast, Dollars and Cents, wherever you normally listen to podcasts. Thanks so much, everyone, for your respectful participation in the chat, for listening, for sharing what you've learned with the men and boys in your life, for going out and buying the book. These are really, really important discussions to have, and we really appreciate your time and your respect listening to this discussion. Thanks so much, and we'll see you next time.
Thank you so much, Liz. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks so much, Chanel. See you next time.
Bye.
Bye, everyone.
Someone said the discount code repeat. What is the discount code again?
Oh, the discount code is Chanel. Oh, no, it is Pan Macmillan, and the discount code is Contos Book Club 29 at the checkout for Australia's biggest book club members. And I'm sure we'll be sending around an email with that discount code reminder as well.
I'm not sure if caps or not, but yeah.
Oh, caps, definitely caps. Thanks, everyone.
Bye, everyone. Thank you.
See you next time. Bye.
Thanks for watching. If you'd like to keep up to date with all our latest research and work, sign up to our newsletter. Delivered every fortnight, it includes behind-the-scenes updates from Richard Dennis, an exclusive cartoon from Judy Horacek, details for our upcoming events and webinars, as well as explainers, graphs, and not to mention the latest cutting-edge research and analysis from the team here on the key issues that are facing Australia. Click the button on your screen to check it out.